December 1944. The war was still raging across Europe, a world split by chaos, fear, and exhaustion. But somewhere far from the thunder of artillery, behind tall wire fences and wooden guard towers, there was a quiet corner of humanity that defied the brutality of war. An American prisoner of war camp in the heart of the United States, rows of neat barracks dusted with snow, a strange silence over the land. Inside those fences were women, Italian nurses, clerks, and auxiliaries, captured during the Allies' campaign in Italy. Many of them had not seen their families for years. They expected nothing from Christmas that year, only another cold, lonely night. Yet fate had something different in store. As Christmas Eve approached, the American officers decided on something remarkable. Against all odds, and against the bitterness of war, they planned a Christmas feast. Not for themselves, but for the Italian women held behind the wire. It was not a military order, it was an act of simple human kindness. When dawn came on December 25, 1944, the camp stirred with something unfamiliar. The smell of roasting turkey, baked bread, and steaming coffee drifting through the frosty air. The prisoners gathered, uncertain and cautious, until they saw the long tables lined with food they had not tasted since before the war. And in that moment, a silence fell, not of fear, but of disbelief and gratitude. The morning began with a silence that felt almost too heavy for sound. Frost clung to the thin metal bars of the fences, catching the first dull rays of December light and scattering them into faint glimmers that barely touched the ground. A breath of wind rolled through the rows of wooden huts, carrying with it the dry rustle of pine needles and the faint, faraway toll of a church bell from a town miles away. Inside the camp, most still slept, Italian women in coarse uniforms, their hair braided or tied back, faces pale from months of captivity. The air smelled faintly of iron smoke and the lingering memory of ration soup cooked the night before. The American guards had been up since before dawn, their boots made soft, deliberate thuds on the frozen earth as they moved back and forth between the kitchen shed and the open yard. Every sound felt exaggerated in the stillness, the clatter of a pot lid, the muted scrape of a wooden table dragged across the ground, the whispered exchanges between men who usually spoke in commanding tones, but now murmured like conspirators. Inside the mess hall, heat radiated from the stoves, and for once it smelled like home. Roast turkey, potatoes, and coffee brewing in large, battered tins. The men worked fast, eyes shining not with pride, but with a quiet sense of purpose. No one had told the prisoners what was happening. Rumors had begun late the night before, spreading like sparks in dry grass. Something about the officers' planning, a surprise, something about the Americans, doing something strange for Christmas. But no one dared believe it. These women had learned the hard way that hope was fragile, and war crushed fragile things without mercy. So when the whistle blew that morning and they were told to gather outside, many expected another inspection, or perhaps a roll call in the freezing wind. One by one, they stepped out of their barracks, their breath forming small clouds in the cold. The crunch of boots on frost-bitten soil filled the air. They walked slowly, half awake, arms folded against the chill. But as they turned the corner of the yard, something made them stop in their tracks. Ahead of them, where the usual grey emptiness of the compound stretched, stood long wooden tables covered in white sheets. Sheets, not tarps, their edges fluttering gently in the breeze. On those tables were plates, tin cups, steaming dishes that glistened in the morning light. The smell of roasted meat and baked bread was unmistakable. It hit them all at once, sharp and warm and utterly unreal. For a moment, no one moved. The guard standing nearby shifted awkwardly, waiting for a reaction. A tall American sergeant cleared his throat, his breath visible in the air, and called out in a voice both firm and kind, "Merry Christmas, ladies." The words hung there, strange, almost absurd, before meaning began to sink in. A few women exchanged uncertain glances. Some laughed quietly, disbelieving. Others simply stared, eyes wide, trying to understand what they were seeing. Then one of the older women, her face lined and weather-worn, took a hesitant step forward. Her shoes crunched against the frost as she approached the nearest table. A young soldier, barely 20, nodded and gestured toward the food. She looked at him for a long second, then reached out and touched the edge of a loaf of bread as if it might vanish. When her fingers came away warm, she whispered something in Italian, a prayer, perhaps, and tears welled in her eyes. That single motion broke the spell. Within moments, soft murmurs rose around the yard. The women began to move closer cautiously, then more freely, their eyes darting between the food and the soldiers who stood behind it. Some of the Americans smiled shyly, others looked down, almost embarrassed by their own generosity. The cultural divide, the language barrier, the invisible weight of war, all of it hung between them. Fragile but somehow less threatening now. The camp's commanding officer, Captain Reed, stepped out onto the porch of the administrative building, his greatcoat buttoned tight. He was not a man known for sentiment. But today, as he watched the scene unfold, his expression softened. He had approved this feast without hesitation. "If we can't remember what we're fighting for," he had told his men the night before, "then we've already lost." The cooks had volunteered immediately, pooling what they could from their own rations. A few cans of vegetables, sugar saved from coffee portions, flour borrowed from nearby depots. They worked through the night under dim light bulbs, their laughter echoing faintly across the empty yard. For them, one had said, stirring a pot, because nobody should spend Christmas hungry. Now, as the women stood there, the effort seemed worth every sleepless hour. They had survived bombing raids, marches, and the humiliation of capture. They had stitched uniforms and tended to wounded soldiers on both sides of the war. Many had lost brothers, fiancés, fathers. To see tables lined with food prepared by those once called enemies, it felt like waking from a long nightmare into a dream too delicate to trust. A younger woman, Lucia no older than 22, stared at the steaming dishes, her eyes glistening. "C'est per noi?" she asked quietly. "For us?" An American corporal nearby nodded, understanding enough of her tone to answer with a simple, heartfelt "yes." "For you." She smiled, uncertain but radiant, and whispered, "Grazie." The word slipped across the cold air, small but sincere, and others repeated it. First a few, then many, until the yard was filled with the soft chorus of Italian voices saying thank you to their guards. The soldiers motioned for them to sit. The benches creaked as the women lowered themselves, still dazed. Plates were passed, spoons clinked against metal, and laughter, hesitant at first, then freer, began to ripple through the air. The smell of food mixed with the clean, crisp scent of pine from the nearby forest. Somewhere, a gramophone crackled to life with a Christmas tune, the melody wavering through static. It didn't matter that most couldn't understand the lyrics. The feeling was enough. One of the cooks brought out a tray of coffee, dark, steaming, and rich. The women clasped the cups with both hands, inhaling deeply, as if trying to memorize the warmth. "We haven't had this since Naples," one of them said, half laughing, half crying. Another took a bite of bread and whispered, "It tastes like before the war." Those simple sentences struck the Americans more deeply than any speech could. They saw, in that instant, the real weight of what they had done. Not just feeding prisoners, but giving them back a fragment of something long lost: dignity. As the meal went on, barriers continued to fall. An American private shyly offered a small paper flower he had made from ration wrappers. The woman who received it tucked it into her uniform pocket and smiled. Another soldier mimed playing a violin, and a group of Italian women giggled, clapping in rhythm to an imaginary tune. They didn't share a language, but gestures bridged the silence easily enough. The cold didn't feel quite so cruel anymore. For a brief hour, the camp was transformed. The barbed wire glistened like tinsel in the sunlight, not as a prison boundary, but as a strange, metallic decoration around a shared celebration. Even the guards on the towers leaned slightly over the rails, watching with quiet smiles. Inside the kitchen, the cook sat on overturned buckets, exhausted, listening to the faint echoes of laughter drifting through the open door. One of them muttered, "That's the sound of peace, right there," and another nodded slowly. Outside, the Italians ate until they could eat no more, and for once, no one cared about the dwindling supply of rations or the distant rumble of war. They were human beings first, soldiers and prisoners second. When it was over, a few of the women gathered what little courage they had and began to sing, softly, shyly, an old Italian Christmas hymn. The melody rose and fell like the whisper of wind across snow. The Americans fell silent, listening, some removing their caps out of respect. The song carried no politics, no allegiance, only longing and gratitude. And in that moment, something shifted in the air, something almost sacred. For once, they were not enemies divided by flags. They were simply people sharing the same fragile hope that maybe, someday soon, the world would stop breaking. As the song faded, Captain Reed walked forward, his boots crunching in the frost. He raised a hand in salute, not as a symbol of victory, but of acknowledgement. The women responded instinctively, standing, bowing slightly, unsure how to reciprocate such a gesture. Then, without words, one of them handed him a small, folded paper star, crudely made from the corner of a letter she had been keeping for months. He looked at it, smiled faintly, and tucked it into his coat pocket. "Thank you," he said quietly. It was all he could think to say. By noon, the tables were nearly empty. Plates stacked neatly, crumbs brushed away, coffee tins cooling in the shade. But the yard was full of a strange, luminous calm. The women lingered, unwilling to return to their barracks just yet. Some stood near the fence, staring at the forest beyond, their hearts heavier and lighter all at once. A few waved timidly to the soldiers, and the soldiers waved back. No one spoke of politics or sides. They didn't need to. The feast had lasted only a few hours, but its echo would last for years. Many of those women would later write about it in diaries, describing the smell of turkey, the unexpected kindness, the look in the soldiers' eyes. Some would call it the first time they believed peace was possible again. And for the men who prepared the meal, it would become a memory recounted quietly to their children, a story that began with a simple truth. Once, in the middle of a war, we chose to be kind. As the winter sun began to set, long shadows stretched across the camp. The women returned slowly to their barracks, carrying not just full stomachs but the fragile warmth of being remembered. Behind them, the soldiers dismantled the tables, laughing softly among themselves, unaware that they had just created a moment that history would almost forget. But hearts never would. Evening fell, and with it came the silence again. But it was different now, gentler, almost peaceful. In one of the huts, a woman lay on her bunk, her hands clasped under her chin, whispering the same words over and over, Grazie, Dio, thank you God. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering footprints, softening edges, and preserving the memory of a day when compassion dared to live among enemies. The air inside the camp had changed. It was as if, for one fragile morning, someone had turned down the volume of war itself. The echoes of laughter lingered faintly, floating between the wooden barracks and curling up into the pale winter sky. Smoke still rose from the field stoves, thin and silver, winding through the crisp December air. The tables, though picked clean, still smelled of roasted turkey and bread, a scent so rare in a place built for survival rather than joy. But something deeper than hunger had been fed that day. The Italian women, still wearing the coarse uniforms marked POW, lingered around the courtyard, reluctant to go back to the barracks. A few clutched tin cups of cooling coffee, sipping slowly as if afraid the warmth would disappear once it was gone. Others stood in small circles, speaking softly in Italian, their words lilting with disbelief, laughter, and the faintest tremor of emotion. The Americans watched from a respectful distance. They were guards, yes, but not today. Today they were witnesses to something they didn't quite have words for. The camp itself, built for order and discipline, now felt almost alive. The flag atop the main pole flapped gently in the breeze, and from one of the watchtowers, a guard leaned against the rail, his rifle slung casually over his shoulder. Below him, two soldiers carried out the last of the empty pots from the kitchen, still smiling from the sight they had just seen. A corporal named Evans, who hadn't laughed in months, caught the eye of one of the Italian women as he passed. She smiled faintly, nodded, and said in halting English, "Good food, thank you." Evans blinked, surprised, then touched the brim of his cap. "You're welcome," he said softly, the words feeling strangely heavy in his chest. It didn't matter that they came from opposite sides of a burning world. In that instant, the war didn't exist. There were no enemies, only people, tired, lonely, hungry for something far greater than food. As noon approached, the women began gathering around the largest table again. Someone had found an old gramophone. One of the American guards had traded a few cigarettes for it in town months before, and set it up on a crate. Its brass horn gleamed in the cold light as the needle crackled over a record. The first notes of a Christmas song drifted out, Silent Night, sung by a trembling voice through layers of static. The melody wavered, ghostly yet familiar, threading through the camp like a breath of peace. The Italians went quiet. Then, as the song continued, a few began to hum along. The sound was soft, hesitant at first, but soon others joined in. The language didn't matter. The tune was older than borders. One by one, their voices rose, blending with the faint music. Even the guards listened, still as statues, the cold forgotten. Then, from among the women, a nurse named Sophia stepped forward. Her voice was clear, delicate, and carried the ache of 1,000 memories. She began to sing in Italian, the same hymn her mother used to sing on Christmas mornings before the war tore their lives apart. Her voice filled the courtyard, rich and trembling. The other women followed her lead, harmonizing softly until the entire camp seemed wrapped in a living melody. Some of the Americans exchanged glances, their eyes misty, their throats tight. One soldier whispered, "Mima used to sing that tune back home." Another nodded, unable to speak. The song had crossed oceans, passed through languages, and found them all here, in the same moment of fragile peace. When the final notes faded, the silence that followed was not empty. It was sacred, a silence that felt like a prayer. No one applauded, no one moved. They simply stood there, breathing in the same cold air, united by the strange miracle of the day. Moments later, laughter broke through again, this time lighter, freer. Someone, perhaps one of the cooks, had brought out a small tin of sugar candies, saved for months. He placed them on the table, grinning sheepishly. "Christmas dessert," he said, and though most of the Italians didn't understand his words, they understood his intent. A few clapped their hands in delight. One woman reached for a candy and pressed it to her lips before eating, as if blessing it. Then came the stories, words bridged by gestures, broken English, and bursts of laughter. The Americans told them about life back home, of wives waiting in small towns, of children who had never seen snow this deep. The Italians shared memories of the sea, of sunlit villages and kitchens that smelled of basil and wine. They spoke with hands as much as mouths, tracing invisible pictures in the air. It didn't matter that half of what was said was lost in translation. What mattered was that they were talking, truly talking, and listening. At one point, a young Italian woman with a mischievous smile mimed the chaos of her capture, dodging imaginary bullets, tripping dramatically, sending everyone around her into fits of laughter. An American sergeant tried to mimic her, puffing his chest and stumbling in exaggerated fashion, and the laughter grew louder still. For a few precious minutes, the war seemed absurd, a cruel joke that no one could believe in anymore. The camp dogs, sensing the change, ran freely between the tables, tails wagging. One leapt into the lap of a woman sitting near the edge, and she held it close, pressing her face into its fur. "Bella creatura," she whispered, tears shining in her eyes. The guard watching her smiled faintly. "That's one of ours," he said, then paused, realizing how strange that sounded. She looked up and nodded. "Ours," she repeated softly. Snow began to fall again, slowly, silently, each flake catching the pale light as it drifted down. The prisoners tilted their faces upward, smiling as the flakes melted on their skin. "Nive di Natal," one murmured. Christmas snow. It covered the camp gently, dusting the tables, softening the sharp edges of the wire fences. Even the guard towers looked less menacing, wrapped in that quiet, glowing whiteness. Someone brought out a small wooden cross that one of the women had carved weeks earlier from a broken crate. She set it gently on the table, and a few women gathered around it, crossing themselves. Without words, the Americans stepped back respectfully. No one had planned a church service, yet it felt as though one had begun anyway. The prisoners prayed in whispers, not for victory or vengeance, but for home, for peace, for the men guarding them, and for the souls already lost. Nearby, Private Evans found himself standing beside Sophia, the singer. She smiled shyly and offered him a piece of bread from her plate. "The last one. Please," she said softly. "For you." He hesitated, then took it, breaking it in half before handing her the other piece. "Then we share," he said. They ate in silence, snow settling in their hair, both pretending not to notice the emotion rising behind their eyes. Later, As the gramophone sputtered through another record, someone produced a harmonica. The notes were uneven, cheerful, and full of life. The Americans clapped along. The Italians danced clumsily in their heavy boots, skirts swirling. Laughter echoed across the compound, carrying through the cold air until it reached the forest beyond the fence, a sound so human that even the crows in the trees seemed to pause. Captain Reed, watching from the edge of the yard, felt something stir deep within him, something he hadn't felt since before the war began. He had seen too much: broken men, ruined towns, endless lines of suffering. Yet here, in the most unlikely of places, he saw the flicker of what the world was fighting for. Not glory, not flags, just decency, the simple grace of human kindness. He turned to his adjutant, who stood beside him. "You see that?" the captain murmured. "That's how peace starts. One table at a time." The younger officer nodded, unable to look away. "Yes, sir," he whispered. "Maybe it starts with bread." As the day wore on, the sunlight began to fade, painting the camp in shades of amber and blue. The snow glowed softly in the dying light. Some of the women began collecting small keepsakes from the meal. A ribbon from a napkin, a scrap of paper from the banner that had read "Merry Christmas." They tucked them carefully into their pockets, tiny proofs that this day had been real. When the guards finally called for evening assembly, no one complained. They lined up quietly, still smiling, exchanging glances that said more than words could. The Americans counted them gently, not as prisoners, but as people they now knew by name: Lucia, Sophia, Elena, Maria. When the roll call ended, Captain Reed stepped forward once more. "Thank you," he said simply. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed emotion. "For sharing this day with us." One of the women called back, "No, Captain." "Thank you," the others echoed her, their voices overlapping in a rush of warmth that carried through the cold. Night settled fast after that. The lights in the barracks flickered on one by one, glowing softly through frosted windows. Inside, the women huddled together, whispering stories of the day, repeating every small detail so none of it would fade. One wrote in her journal under the dim bulb, her pencil trembling as she tried to capture the feeling. "Today, I remembered what it means to be alive." Outside, the guards returned to their posts, but the usual tension was gone. One hummed Silent Night under his breath. Another tucked the harmonica into his coat pocket, smiling. The gramophone had long since gone silent, but the music still seemed to hang in the air, faint and eternal. In the officers' quarters, Captain Reed sat at his desk, penning a letter by lamplight. He wrote not to his superiors, but to his wife back home. "Dearest, today I saw a miracle in this frozen place. We shared a meal with those the world calls enemies. Yet in their eyes, I saw only mothers, sisters, daughters, the same humanity we've been fighting to preserve. If you had seen their faces, you'd understand. For a few hours, the war stopped. It didn't surrender. It just forgot to fight." He folded the letter, sealed it, and stared for a long time at the paper star the Italian woman had given him earlier. He placed it beside the lamp, watching the light pass through it. In the women's barracks, Sophia lay awake, listening to the wind. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear faint harmonica notes carried by the breeze. She smiled to herself, whispered another prayer, and closed her eyes. For the first time since her capture, she dreamed not of home, but of peace. The snow kept falling through the night, covering every mark left by the day's footsteps. By morning the tables were gone, the courtyard empty again. But something had changed forever in that camp, something invisible yet undeniable. They had shared food, music, and laughter. They had seen each other not as enemies, but as reflections of the same fragile hope. And though none of them knew it then, years later, long after the war had ended, some would still write letters exchanging memories of that day. They would call it the day the fences disappeared, when kindness triumphed over conflict, if only for a single, shining afternoon. When the last echo of laughter faded and the night swallowed the American camp, the memory of that Christmas feast did not vanish with the snow. It lingered, like the faint scent of bread long after the oven has gone cold. By morning, the courtyard was silent again, the tables dismantled, the dishes stacked neatly in the kitchen shed. But in the hearts of those who had been there, both guards and prisoners, something had shifted forever. The Italian women woke early out of habit, expecting the usual monotony of camp life to return. But as they stepped outside, the world was hushed under a fresh layer of snow. The footprints from yesterday were gone, erased overnight, as if the earth itself wanted to preserve that single perfect day untouched. The air felt cleaner, the fences less cruel. A few of them stood there quietly, eyes closed, listening to the stillness. Even the guards seemed gentler, their footsteps slower, their words softer. Inside one of the barracks, Lucia, the young woman who had first dared to smile during the feast, sat on her bunk with a small notebook. She had stolen scraps of paper weeks ago, sewing them into the lining of her uniform. Now she wrote carefully in pencil, the letters uneven from the cold. She wrote about the feast, the warmth of the food, the sound of the Americans' laughter. She wrote about Captain Reed's eyes when he saluted them, about Sophia's voice when she sang, and about the snow that fell like peace descending from the heavens. She didn't know if anyone would ever read her words, but she needed to keep them. To remember that even in a cage, beauty had entered once. In the guards' quarters, Evans packed his gear. His unit was being reassigned, the war was shifting, and new orders had come. He folded his uniform carefully and paused when he saw a small scrap of paper fall from the pocket. A piece of the Merry Christmas banner the Italians had torn as keepsakes. He had forgotten that one of the women had pressed it into his hand as they'd said goodbye, whispering, "Par recordare," to remember. He held it now, turning it over in his fingers. It was nothing, just a torn ribbon of paper, and yet it carried the weight of everything he didn't know how to say. He slipped it back into his jacket and looked out the window toward the barracks, where faint singing rose again, distant and soft. For the prisoners, life returned to its routine roll calls, chores, inspections, but they carried an invisible shield now, a quiet resilience drawn from that day. When they were cold, they remembered the warmth of the kitchen fires. When they were lonely, they remembered the kindness in those unfamiliar eyes. And when fear crept in, they remembered that once, even in war, someone had chosen compassion over cruelty. Days turned into weeks. Letters from home arrived rarely, and when they did, the women shared them like sacred texts, reading them aloud in whispers. But sometimes in those letters, there were surprises, small hints that news of their Christmas had traveled. An American journalist station nearby had written about the Feast of Forgiveness, and somehow copies of the story reached local towns. Civilians sent small parcels to the camp, fabric, soap, even chocolate wrapped in paper. The officers didn't stop them. Captain Reed simply said, "Let it be." Winter passed into spring. The snow melted, turning the ground to mud. The barbed wire glistened under new sunlight, and birds began to return to the surrounding woods. War still raged across oceans and continents, but in this small place, there was a pocket of fragile peace that refused to die. The women tended to small gardens near their huts, planting seeds found in the kitchen waste. The soldiers sometimes helped them, pretending not to notice when a flower sprouted where only dust had been before. Sophia continued to sing in the evenings. Her voice floated through the camp, echoing against the fences, softening them somehow. Guards would pause on their rounds just to listen. One of them, Evans's replacement, a quiet man from Oklahoma, wrote home describing the sound. "It's strange," he told his wife, "but when she sings, I forget there's a war on. It feels like standing in church again." Then, one warm morning, word arrived that the war in Europe was ending. The Americans gathered the prisoners in the yard and read the official message aloud: Italy was free. The women stood still, unable to react at first. Freedom, a word they had dreamed of but forgotten how to believe in. Some laughed, others cried. A few simply sank to their knees, hands over their faces. The guards watched in silence, moved beyond words. In the days that followed, preparations began to repatriate the prisoners. Papers were signed, belongings gathered. The women washed their uniforms one last time, hung them neatly to dry, and spoke in whispers about what waited for them back home, if home even still existed. Many had lost everything: families, houses, cities reduced to rubble. Yet they carried something the war couldn't destroy: the memory of kindness. On the morning of departure, the camp gates opened. Trucks waited on the road, engines humming softly. The women lined up, their belongings packed in small cloth bags. Captain Reed stood near the gate, hat tucked under his arm. One by one, they passed him, and each stopped to thank him in her own way. Some offered a handshake, others a brief salute. A few, with tears in their eyes, simply whispered, "Gracie." When Sophia's turn came, she reached into her coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. A song lyric she had written the night after the Christmas feast. "For you," she said, "so you remember too." He took it carefully, eyes glinting. "I will," he promised. When the last truck rolled away and the dust settled, the camp felt emptier than ever. The guards went about their duties quietly. No one spoke much that day. Reed stood by the gate for a long time, staring at the horizon where the convoy had disappeared. The paper in his hand fluttered gently in the wind. Later, he pinned it inside his journal beside his wife's letters. Years passed. The war ended, the camp was dismantled, and the land eventually returned to farmland. But the people who had lived those days carried the story with them, woven into the fabric of their lives. In 1952, in a small village near Naples, Lucia sat at a wooden table surrounded by her grandchildren. She was older now, her hair silver and her hands lined. On the table lay her old notebook, its pages yellowed but still legible. Every Christmas, she opened it and read aloud the story of that day in the camp. The kindness of strangers, the taste of bread after hunger, the laughter that made her believe in goodness again. Her grandchildren listened wide-eyed, unable to imagine their grandmother as a prisoner. But in her voice, they could hear something timeless: gratitude. Across the ocean, in a quiet American town, Captain Reed had retired to a small house by the sea. Every December, he opened a box marked Italy 1944. Inside were a few photographs, the paper star, and Sophia's handwritten song. He would read it aloud by the fire, the words faded but still powerful. His daughter once asked him why he kept them. He smiled and said, "Because once in the middle of hell I saw heaven." As the years stretched into decades, the memory refused to fade. Veterans' reunions, letters exchanged across continents, even the rare meeting between those who had once faced each other across barbed wire, all were born from that single act of compassion. The story was retold in newspapers, then forgotten, then rediscovered again by historians digging through letters and journals. Each time it resurfaced, it felt new, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, light had existed. For the Italian women, that light became a legacy. They taught their children that kindness was stronger than hate, that humanity could survive even the worst of wars. For the Americans, it became a lesson they carried into peacetime, that the greatest victory was not won on battlefields but in hearts. In the 1970s, a local historian visited the site where the camp once stood. The buildings were gone, replaced by fields of tall grass and wildflowers. But if you looked closely, you could still see faint outlines of foundations, the ghostly remnants of fences swallowed by time. The historian placed a small wooden plaque there carved with simple words, "Ere on Christmas 1944, enemies became friends." Decades later still, an Italian filmmaker would stumble across Lucia's old diary in an archive and adapt it into a documentary. In the film, her recorded voice, frail but steady, recited her words, "That day the war ended for us, even if the world didn't know it yet." The screen faded to black over images of snow falling, tables set with bread, and women smiling through tears. Time continued its endless march, carrying away faces, names, and nations. But stories, true ones, have a way of surviving everything. And this one lived on, told quietly every Christmas somewhere in Italy, in America, in the quiet corners of memory. Because it was never just a story about a meal. It was about what happens when people choose compassion over command, when they look past uniforms and accents and see themselves reflected in the eyes of the so-called enemy. It was proof that even in captivity, humanity could not be captured. If you stand in that field today, nothing remains of the camp. The wind hums through the grass, the trees whisper, and sometimes, if you listen closely, you might imagine hearing faint laughter carried on the breeze. Perhaps it's just the wind, or perhaps it's the ghosts of that long-ago Christmas, still singing softly to remind us that even in our worst wars, the soul of kindness endures. In the end, the story of those Italian women and their American captors is not about victory or defeat. It's about redemption. Quiet, unrecorded, human redemption. A reminder that history is not only written by generals and governments, but also by ordinary people who dared to act with grace when it mattered most. And so, every year when snow falls somewhere in the world, when lights glow in windows and families gather at tables, the spirit of that Christmas returns, invisible but alive. It exists in every shared smile, every forgiven wrong, every act of generosity that defies bitterness, because kindness, once given, never truly dies. It lingers, passing through generations like a whisper of warmth in cold air, reminding us that even in the darkest winters of history, the human heart remembers how to be light.